Apologize for that, everybody. That's my fault, and I'm sure that I'm not the first one to have a Zoom or an audio problem in the last 6 months. So I apologize, and thank you for joining us. My name is Joth Ricky. I'm the president of Dutch Bros Coffee, and proud to be the chairman of the Oregon Business Plan Subcommittee, of which this year we look ahead to the next 10 years of Oregon's economy and build a business plan that will lead us to that direction for the next decade. For those of you that have joined us over the last few sessions, you'll know that we're organizing this series around a 3-part strategy framework to inform the state's recovery of planning work. Today will be about the piece of our framework focused on digging ourselves out of the deep economic hole that we find ourselves in and reviving the economy as an engine of broadly shared opportunity. We think economic growth is essential for a more shared prosperity. Growth creates new opportunities and spurs needed wage growth. And growth is the surest way to close our huge budget gaps. We saw that in the latest revenue forecast. Even though it got a little bit better, it's still a deep hole as you look ahead. In other words, growth starts the flywheel of a circle of prosperity, where growth expands state resources that are used to make investments in our children and our families, that in turn fuel long-term growth. But we know this model is a bit too simplistic. The last couple of decades have proven that growth without intention alone is insufficient to deliver more shared prosperity, as inequality has actually grown as the economy has expanded. Our future sessions will tackle the insufficient part of that statement and specifically what we need to be doing to create better access for opportunity. But the focus of today is how we can create more and better opportunities for Oregonians. On that point, we know that we need to be more intentional about how we grow and ensuring that there's better access to opportunity, particularly now that the likely shape of this recovery is basically a K-shaped recovery. In other words, for most high and medium wage workers, they've already recovered. They're back to where they were in January, but low wage workers are still deep in a hole, and with a lot of uncertainty on the horizon, permanent business closures mounting, and recovery stalling with another round of stimulus delayed and colder months approaching. And this is just adding to a world of increasing job polarization and inequality, which only promise to worsen without intentional action. So we know we need to act, and we need to do so with urgency, but we do so with intention. And as we heard in our last session with Steve Brown and Toya Fick, with an eye fixed on the future, lest we miss crucial opportunities to grow. Today, we'll hear some perspectives on what to be thinking about as we prepare for a long-term recovery full of shared prosperity. And we'll hear about what specifically we can do relative to one key to our future: innovation and entrepreneurship, and making sure people of color can better participate in this crucial path to opportunity and prosperity. But before I turn it over to our first keynote speaker, I want to take a quick minute to thank the sponsors of the Oregon Business Plan. We're grateful for their ongoing support, and without it, we would not be able to put on great events like this summit series. And because of our sponsors' generous support, we're able to offer these virtual events at no cost. We believe strongly in offering these at no charge to allow access to these conversations as we move forward together in recovery for a shared prosperity. I'd like to personally thank our sponsors: MJ Murdoch Charitable Trust, Bank of America, Pape, ADEC, Dusky Goose, Oregon Business and Industry, Pacific Power, Portland General Electric, Kaiser Permanente, Northwest Natural, Ochoco Lumber Company, the Portland Trailblazers, US Bank, and my team at Dutch Bros. Thank you for your leadership and support for the Oregon Business Plan. So it's my honor to introduce to you our first keynote. I've had a chance to listen to Christian over the last 6 months and his perspective on things that are going on, not only in Oregon, but around the country and really around the world. Christian Ketels is a visiting executive at Harvard Business School and a globally recognized expert on the competitiveness of locations, on the role of strategy in overcoming the pandemic, and coming out of this whole thing much stronger. I'd like to welcome Christian Ketels.
Well, welcome everyone. Joel, thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's really my honor to be part of your leadership series. Share a little bit of my perspective from other regions, other countries, how they try to deal with the pandemic, but quite frankly, also learning from Oregon. I think what the Oregon Business Council does, what the Oregon Business Plan has been doing for many years, is really an example for many others, how the private sector can lead these type of efforts. Just a quick note on this first slide, you see one of my activities is that I'm an advisory board chair of the TCI network, a global network of folks and public organizations that work on competitiveness issues, often on cluster development. The first time I was elected to the board was actually in Portland, Oregon. So it's a long-standing relationship that I have with your state, and it was great in the context of this discussion to be able to reconnect and learn more about what's going on. What I wanted to do is really to do two things. First, try to help us think a little bit more systematically about what the impact of COVID, of the pandemic, is on long-term growth issues, on the foundations for shared prosperity, as Dross laid it out for us. The impact has been very short-term so far. It has been strong. It has been impactful on many dimensions. But it's not quite as obvious in how we should think about these long-term conditions. I'll try to unpeel the onion a little bit on that question. The second part will then try to turn to how can we build a plan to get us out of this, to build a better new reality once we're beyond the immediate impact of the pandemic. And as far as possible from afar, I'll try to kind of work in some perspectives on Oregon as well, hopefully to give us a good set of issues to talk about in our panel discussion afterwards. Now, first of all, obviously, while COVID and the pandemic is really the overarching challenge to our societies, really around the world, there are many other issues that particularly, I think, have impacted the United States and have impacted Oregon. There have been natural disasters, the fires, but also the floods that have hit parts of your state. And obviously, I think the U.S. overall at the moment is in a very difficult state with a very politicized environment, Black Lives Matters, demonstrations, kind of really grappling for the soul of the nation. What is the direction that this country will take? We can't address all of these issues here. That's not the intent. But I think it's important to really think about that background as you look at what's going on overall. One of the things that has happened is really that the pandemic has created a lot of uncertainty. And I have to be very upfront that economists don't have the answer. We really don't know what the future exactly will look like. What we have seen is that the context has become much more complex. We need to think much more about scenarios. We need to think about our ability to build resilience to different types of outcomes. So that's the frame with which we have to look at, what are the things that are ahead of us. That being said, we can say something about the future. Joff talked about the K-type recovery. We early on in March, April talked a lot about V and L. I think the discussion was really about, are we going to lose output? Are we going to regain the level of economic activity that we've seen before the crisis? And what's going to happen to our long-term growth? I think initially there was a lot of optimism that we would see a V recovery, basically, a loss, but then going back onto the growth rate that we had before. This is what we've seen in some of the previous crises, especially in the US, which is an economy that's very dynamic and can really kind of regain its activity relatively quickly. Then there were concerns that, in fact, we might see the opposite. We might see an L, no recovery, and then a lower growth rate as well. I think what we are likely to see, from my perspective, is this sort of square root type of development at the macro level. We already see the roots of a very strong recovery, but I think there are also strong signs that we will not actually go back to where we would have been without the crisis, and we might, in fact, end up with a lower growth rate moving forward. This is exactly the type of scenario that today the IMF came out with. A very long, drawn out, and very uneven recovery that we're going to see. Now, they are talking about the world, but I think we're going to see the same dynamics in the US. What's behind that? Well, behind the positive recovery that we've seen is really a very unprecedented economic policy response. And I think here the US, at least so far, has been really even stronger than many other parts of the world. Very strong fiscal impulse, very strong reaction by the Fed, and that has created an environment where the economy kind of could avoid a meltdown and really come back relatively quickly. Now, the other reason I think that people are more optimistic is that this crisis was really the result of an external shock. It was not because there was kind of imbalances in the balance sheets of firms or households, which we had seen at the global financial crisis, or that prices and wages were out of whack. So I think we are, we didn't see macroeconomic things that take time to readjust as the driver of this crisis. And we really haven't lost anything in terms of our labor capacity, our labor force, our capital stock. On the negative side, though, quantity matters, and this has been a crisis of unprecedented scale and breadth. It has been global. It has hit many sectors that usually are quite resistant or resilient in crisis, especially labor-intensive sectors. This is why we're now seeing things feeding through to unemployment, and we know that that's really bad for demand, and that's really bad for kind of the overall dynamism of the economy. So it's sort of these two forces that are fighting with each other, but that at the moment I think give rise to thinking about this type of square root recovery, which is not a very pretty sight. It does mean that we will have for years difficult challenges to grapple with. Now, what has been the policy response? We quickly had to learn to think in phases. We had to think first about how could we use the public health response and then the social policy response to mobilize for crisis response in the healthcare system, but then also help people that has lost their job, that has lost their livelihoods. In terms of the economic policy response, a lot of it was initially focused on macro, partly because people were afraid of a meltdown of the financial system. Gladly, we were able to avert that, but also because it required a lot of resources that were needed to kind of spend on public health, on the social policy response, and keeping the economic activity as high up as possible. On that side, I think we've made a lot of progress. Unfortunately, now I think the situation politically in the US is difficult, and it's still not clear what the next step of that response will be. What I also want to point out, though, is that macro and these billion-dollar amounts that you read about in the paper is not enough. We really need to think about, for our long-term shared prosperity outlook, what are we going to do in terms of the more microeconomic elements of our economy? The skill base, the infrastructure, the rules and regulations, the way that companies and the public sector work together. These are many individual decisions that have to be made together in a strategic sense. And this is really what competitiveness is all about. Competitiveness is here described, and this quote, if you can read it on the top right hand, is from Mike Porter. It's really two things. It is about enabling companies that operate in a location, in a state like Oregon, to be successful, to be profitable, to be able to grow, but to do it in a way that generates returns for society, that really generates high-paying jobs and supports the society as we want to see it. So two terms that are very important for competitiveness is, on the one hand, productivity. This is important because productivity, so the creation of value, is not equal to profitability. You can have a very profitable company if you're a monopolist and you're not productive at all. But about creating value for society means you have to be both profitable and productive. Only then can you really create shared prosperity. And I think that is a lesson that we've learned even more during this crisis and during the challenges that the COVID pandemic has forced upon us. Now, what have we learned about upgrading competitiveness, which is really the foundation for creating more shared prosperity and enabling our societies to grow? One thing is that there's no silver bullet. It's many things that matter. And that's actually not how economists usually think. We always look for the one big thing that across all times and all regions has the highest impact on prosperity. Competitiveness is sort of like a puzzle. You really need to be able to do a lot of things in concert and orchestrate them right. Then you're getting improvements. Then you can support growth and shared prosperity. Second thing is that what matters depends on what you already have. So there is no one blueprint that comes from one smart thinker, and that has to be applied in every state and every country around the world. No, You have to understand yourself, and then you can add to that in the most coherent way, in ways that address your weaknesses, but also leverage and enhance the advantages that you already have. So there is a lot of context specificity, location by location, sector by sector, that we have to have in mind. But we also know that there is a framework to understand this, and this is what competitiveness provides. And in fact, I would say that now, there is often not that much disagreement on what needs to be done to make a state like Oregon more competitive. So why is it not happening? It is because the how is actually very difficult, and this is something that economists usually don't focus on, but that groups like the Oregon Business Plan really have to focus on. How do we make sure that we not only identify what needs to be done, but really getting it done? What are some of the learnings here? Well, one thing is that, it is not enough to identify all of the things that are sort of broken or that we need to improve. We really need to think about how we can sequence stuff over time so that it really happens in line with our capabilities to make change happen. Pick your battles. Think smartly about what you have to build today so that you can make more improvements tomorrow. Second is something that I already mentioned. Think not only about your weaknesses that you need to address, which we often do, what are the weaknesses or the things in the business environment that are bothering you as a company, but think also about your advantages, about your strength, about your capabilities, because that's ultimately going to lead to the success of your location. It's not enough just to address your weaknesses. Companies always think in their strategy like that. What is our unique advantage? Locations seldom do. And the third point is, how do we make that happen? Well, it always requires people. And it's really not the old model that it's only government can do this. First of all, government is not one entity. There are different levels, there are different agencies, so you need to do a lot of orchestrating within government. But then you also need to bring in the private sector, both companies, associations, academic institutions, and others. So upgrading competitiveness is like a marathon that you do in a team. It is hard, but it's something that you can kind of get guidelines on how to move forward. So how do you usually do that? Well, you start with a diagnostic. You try to figure out, what is it that our location has and what do we needs to address in order to progress. That means looking at the competitiveness fundamentals, mentioned skills, infrastructure, rules and regulations, taxation, all of these things. And then you can also look at the outcomes because they're kind of the revealed evidence of what works and what doesn't work. If you look at COVID, it obviously has affected our economic outcomes, but it actually has done relatively little to the fundamentals. They have hardly changed. If that would be all that has changed, we would long-term just go back to where we were before, because it's the fundamentals that really count in the long term. But two things have changed. One is the global economic context in which you operate, in which you're competing, has really fundamentally changed. And the other, the balance of political powers that really shift and affect what type of decisions you're able to make and how effective you are in implementing them might also have been affected. Let me talk about these two in turn. First, how has the context changed? Well, the most obvious is digitalization. We're online now. There has been a rapid change in consumer behavior, but also in the processes within and across companies. We don't exactly know yet what's going to stay and what's temporary, but I think a lot of people believe that the changes that we've now seen over the course of weeks or months are the changes that they expected, but that would have happened over years. So that means some of the advantages might be less important now than you had in the past. Others, for example, your digital literacy, are much more important. But this is not the only thing that has changed. The global geopolitical environment is changing. China is now 10% larger than it was before the crisis. The US is not even back at its level. Europe the same. Globalization was already changing, trade war, disruption of global value chains, changes in terms of where economic activity is there. And you see a lot of topics here. I can't depict that future, but I think if you want to design a robust plan for Oregon, you need to at least develop some scenarios on what you think is most likely and think through how that's going to affect your state and your clusters and your companies. We'll get back to that. The second point is sort of the political environment. And this is where we get to a thing that people often like to talk about when they say a crisis is an opportunity. In what sense is a crisis an opportunity? Well, we try to look at the empirical data for the past and basically did the exercise and said, okay, so after a macroeconomic downturn, a year where you went through crisis, what's happening to competitiveness and then productivity growth later on? And you see here the red and the green bars. The green bars are years where there was no crisis before, so they are higher. The red bars are the ones where you had a crisis before. What this says is that after a crisis, on average, we're actually not better. We're worse. We're poorer. Our competitiveness is not growing as dynamically. So all this talk about crisis as an opportunity is just lying to ourselves. There is a real cost. However, we then look more at the overall distribution of outcomes. So this is what you see on the bottom right-hand side of that graph. There is a right-hand side fat right-hand tail, which is about 20% of the cases where despite the crisis, there was a huge increase of productivity growth afterwards. Why does that happen? Well, it has happened because the political situation has changed and changes were made that were not possible before the crisis. This is sort of what Manco Olson talked about after World War II. The blocking institutions are away. We have a new chance to think about, as a society, as a political community, what we want to do. So on average, we are poorer after the crisis. But there is no need not to do anything about it. We can actually do something about it. So let's turn a little bit to a discussion on how you could systematically develop a strategy, business plan for Oregon that sets you up for shared prosperity. First of all, it is really about setting your ambition. And that's usually easy. You set those lofty goals. But I think at the US and Oregon as a state is at a very important point in time where it again is required to think about what type of societies do you want to have? What type of outcomes do you want to see? What type of opportunities do you want to create for large shares of your society? My colleague Michael Porter has created the Social Progress Index, and the US is really one of the big outliers on going down on this, kind of not doing as good as you would expect from its GDP per capita. Oregon, and this is 1 or 2 years older, data is actually doing better on social progress than you would expect from its GDP numbers, but there are also some weaknesses. So kind of thinking through what type of society you want to have is really, I think, a useful exercise and important, hopefully, might even lead to some healing in your society. But then the next question is, okay, it's not just an ambition. As a place to do business, what's the value proposition that we want to give? What do we want to offer? What is the reasons that we want to give to companies that are pondering whether they should come to Oregon? And here you find some examples. I don't have time to go through that in detail, but there are different advanced economies, and there is always a pretty clear idea what at the core is really making them attractive. They're not good at everything. Often these value propositions are also not the result of a very stringent planning process, but they have emerged a coherent set of qualities that is attractive to some companies and some types of industries and less so than others. What might that look like for Oregon? I think you have to start with the sort of assets that the state already has. Core, of course, is your natural beauty, the landscape and what that does. First of all, that underpins a number of industries, whether it's food or forest-related products that directly draw on the natural resources. But then it also very importantly has been the magnet to draw skilled peoples to the state that are then attractive for other sectors. And it also kind of underpins specific type of demand conditions, especially if you think about the type of people that came to Oregon, that love outdoor sports, and that want to see advanced equipment there. That's one dimension. Another one is your location. And I think there is one aspect that you are at the Pacific Rim, so this might create huge opportunities towards Asia, which is the growing part of the global economy, opportunities that you need to figure out how to leverage. But then it's also within the US in terms of your neighboring states, Washington State and California to the south in particular. What are the industries that you could connect with there, the clusters that exist there? And of course, you see that has happened in the IT sector. Finally, you're not starting with a blank sheet of paper. you already have a vibrant economy, you have some strong clusters, and you have very important anchor firms. Thinking about how you can leverage those, make sure that there's growth around them. That is what keeps Oregon attractive to them, but that also creates much more economic activity and value creation beyond what's happening in these individual companies. So it's really the interface of these different types of assets and strength, I think, that a future value proposition for Oregon might be built around. So once you have a value proposition, it actually becomes much easier to prioritize what you need to do. Because that's essentially about making sure that the value proposition is not just a promise, but becomes a reality. So you can think about that for this value, what is it that we need to do? So are we addressing the key type of issues that are set out in the value proposition through the activities that we're doing? So this is about doing the right things. Are we pursuing groups of interrelated activities? So there's actually not just 1 + 1 is 2, but 1 + 1 is 3. You know, because you have better connectivity and you have more skilled people, you become much more attractive in terms of the combination of the two individual companies. And then third, think about what you're able to execute. How are we going to do this? So how do we need to sequence this? What I talked a little bit about early on. So it's not just about doing the right things. It's also about doing them right. And this is where clusters really come in. You know, sometimes people think, well, cluster is just this odd cult of people that think that this is, a silver bullet and, this is a magic solution. No, it's not. But what it does give us is a specific context where you understand what really drives companies, where they are successful, and you can give answers and change business environment conditions in ways that are particularly relevant to that set of companies. This is important now because COVID has not hit every sector the same way. You know that in Oregon, semiconductor industry has been doing very well. Others not so much. You need to understand these particularities to come up with the right answers. Clusters allow you to kind of have a discussion at the right type of level of granularity. Another point to think about when you think about execution is what are the levers that we really control? And I think it's very important here to think about the role that a state can play versus the federal government. Now in the US, states have a lot of power. There's a lot of things that you in Oregon can do and decide yourselves. But not everything. There are huge political decisions and also budgets that are basically made available at the federal level. So it would be a mistake to just think about Oregon as kind of an individual island, a country in itself that makes these big choices to address the type of challenges that you've identified. You have to think very hard about what is it that we can really shape ourselves, and what is it where we need to influence Washington, or where we can draw on instruments that the federal government provides us through its agencies, whether it's SBA or NIH or EDA or whatever the agency is, or infrastructure investments. Make sure you understand the unique angle that you are giving, that you have from that level of the state. If you do all those things, I think you can come up with a coherent strategy. And again, this is not rocket science. But what this is really a logical change that starts with this outcome ambition. What type of society and economy are we trying to build here? What's our aspiration? It's translated into value proposition. How do we intend to create that outcome? What are we offering to companies that are here or that are considering coming to our state? That then kind of gives you the guidance to identify an action plan, both cross-cutting and cluster-specific, and is finally underpinned by a delivery structure that can help make this happen. So let me close by with two slides. One kind of more general on Oregon, and then the last one with some observations from very far away, since now I'm here in Stockholm and unfortunately not with you in Portland. So what are some of the issues Oregon really needs clarity on? I do think your ambitions is something that is really high on the agenda. What weaknesses in the fabric of our society and economy have become apparent during the pandemic? And what do we want to do so that we don't end up in this type of situation as well? Again, a lot of the problems that became visible during the pandemic, I think, have been festering for a while. So thinking about that, I think, is really important. The second part is, how has the competitive landscape been changed? What I talked about in the slide with this big yellow bubble. What are the drivers? What are the scenarios that you see based on the information that your companies have, that your industrial leaders have from how they experience their markets? What does it mean for the attractiveness and the growth potential of your existing clusters? And what does it mean for the value of the competitive advantages that Oregon has today? I think that needs to be the starting point of then your analysis on what needs to be done. Finally, really being clear about the roles. On the one hand, between the state and the federal government, what is it really that you can do in Oregon, and what is it that you want from the federal government? And the other one, how does the private and the public sector ideally work together so that this becomes really a successful and effective team effort for the state of Oregon? Finally, then, few passing thoughts from Stockholm. So Oregon is a beautiful place. There's a lot of natural beauty and assets. But I think it's important to understand that this, as well as your geographic location, is an opportunity. It doesn't itself create value. So yes, the natural beauty attracts people, but for them to stay, you have to do a lot of other things. You have to think about your education system, about safety, housing, affordability, taxation. So all of these things have to come together. You've given an opportunity, but you have to make it the value that it potentially could give. Then if you think about your clusters and anchor firms, again, I think you have to have a plan. You need to know, how do you want to develop them given the changes that are happening at the moment in all of these sectors. Second question is, what are the opportunities to build something new? Are there things at the intersection? Do we have a plan to really use our entrepreneurial spirit that clearly exists in the state? Often these type of things happen at the intersections or at the borderlines of things that you already do, but kind of translate it into something else. So maybe there's more in renewable energy, for example. I think area that would fit very well with your overall profile. And finally, I started out here at the end to talk about aspiration. I think it's really about, how do you create the right kind of balance? You need an economy that's competitive. Joss talked about that as well. Without profitable companies, there is no shared prosperity, but it's not enough. So we need to think about what really works to make sure that we have an economy that is both competitive and that delivers for a large part of your society. So thank you very much, and very much looking forward to our discussion. Let me hand it back to Joth.
Wow. Thank you, Christian. And thank you for laying out some great thinking and things that will really kind of just help and create our strategic discussion going forward. And let's continue with that. I want to welcome three of the smartest thinkers that we have associated with the Oregon Business Plan, and I'm thankful to be part of the steering committee with them. And they're gonna have a discussion about some of the key issues Oregon should be keyed in on over the long term. I'd like to welcome Rukiah Adams, Chief Investment Officer of Mara Memorial Trust, Patrick Kreitzer, President and CEO of the Tillamook County Creamery Association, and Stephen Nigro, former Hewlett Packard executive, joining Christian for this discussion. And I'd like to kick this off, and I'm going to start with Rukiah, and let's get this started with you.
Thanks, John. What an amazing presentation, Christian. I can't wait for you to come and visit us in Oregon, or I'll make my way to Stockholm to see you and talk more about these ideas. A few things jumped out at me in listening to his points. The slide that said do the right things and do things right really jumped out at me as we face this exogenous shock from this virus. In particular, some of the social and political activity in the street is people believe social justice is a form of economic development. And I heard some of that in what Christian was presenting. I'm also really interested to talk more about how our natural resources and stewardship of natural resources and attracting tech can exist without competing with our heritage organizations in agriculture in particular. So I look forward to a conversation with my panel mates, and want to thank Christian for his inspired presentation.
I think maybe the concept here was we were all going to have a few reflections and comments. So I guess I'll go next. But I reflected in Josh's comments and what Christian shared with us was this idea that a growing economy is essential for a thriving society. I mentioned this because while it might be academically obvious, one of the things that happens naturally is that we sort of devolve often into this kind of or positioning. So either businesses are doing well in a low tax, low regulatory environment, or businesses are appropriately carrying their their load as it relates to funding public services and contributing to the increase in quality of life. And Christian referenced the Michael Porter quote about competitiveness, referencing that that an ideal state, as I hear it, is an and state where businesses are able to effectively compete and they're supporting an increase in wages and quality of life. And so I think there's a real opportunity for us as we move forward to move more in the direction of and than or, and often, like in other places, often the conversation has sort of devolved. And of course, as we talk about a growing, thriving economy, like in other aspects of society, we need to incorporate the concept of intentional inclusion. I mean, we've been through cycles before, of course, here in Oregon, economic cycles, and while we tend to get hit harder by an economic downturn, we tend to recover faster. That has a lot of elements to it, but one of the things that we've seen, unfortunately, is that during those recoveries, not everyone is participating in those. And so, I applaud the business plan's focus on creating an inclusive recovery in a way that maybe we haven't achieved before. The other thing I'll mention is that, as Christian said, he talked about the how is the hard part. And, fundamental to competitive strategy is making choices on how you allocate and organize limited resources to address the biggest opportunities, whether that be for a business or for a region. And, I think that's a real call to action for us to work together in new ways and to collaborate around choosing a value proposition and how we implement that. So, I'm bullish, as I've said many times publicly, on Oregon's ability to come together in ways that may not be available in other regions of the country. If we can align around this idea of competitive businesses operating in a competitive position while at the same time supporting shared prosperity and quality of life increases, and do that in new, even more collaborative ways. I'm excited about how we can come out of this situation.
Okay, Patrick, I'll go from here. Again, let me give a little bit of context myself, because as I sit in the Oregon business plan, I think I bring somewhat of a different perspective, given my history at HP. Certainly in running the HP printing business, which was one of my responsibilities, certainly a very global business, to be sure, with a high-tech bias. So that's kind of want to give that context as I get into this, because my observations come from that point of view. So it's certainly going to influence my thoughts. As part of that responsibility, we had operations, or I should say I had operations around the world, not just manufacturing, but development operations. In fact, I would say over half our activities were outside the U.S. And interesting, Christian showed some of those countries that have emphasized kind of their secret formulas on their Israel and Singapore. And those are two that we had significant operations that I have personally been involved with quite a bit over the years. But with that point of view, I live in the Northwest, and so I kind of look at the Northwest through those lenses, and I see many strengths, and similar to what Christian talked about. Beautiful location, kind of has a very creative vibe. It's known for that, and certainly it's in the news a lot lately, which in many ways can be a good thing. It kind of shows the independent thinking that comes out of the Northwest, which is an asset when you think about creativity. And it has some great anchors, competitive advantage, if you will. In the physical science world, things like Intel is just world class at what they do. Of course, Nike and the athletic wear, and those are just incredible strengths for Oregon to build on. So I think those are things that I see as unique to Oregon and some of those unique capabilities. And I think you kind of overlay this unique capabilities with some trends that are out there. And the one that I certainly have spent a lot of time on is what is known as Industry 4.0, the Industrial Revolution 4, however you want to talk about it. But it certainly is something that dominates conversations at things like the World Economic Forum. And not, I won't go into it in a significant way, but you just kind of can think about 4.0, Industry 4.0, is how technology, all the technologies you read about it, artificial intelligence, big data, Internet of Things, 3D printing, additive, which is another business I was involved with, how that's going to actually change the products, not only kind of the products we use, but how products are produced. And how I like to think about that future state is ones and zeros coming in and smart products coming out, and very smart factories. So when Oregon thinks about its business plan, I think there can be an overlay of this 4.0 dynamics. And what does that mean? Well, it means those factories are going to need people, but they're going to need a different set of talent than what you might think about that old traditional smokestack factory. It's going to be people with creative problem-solving skills as well as some tech ability. So tech's going to be across everything. So I think that's kind of how I think about the asset for Oregon. And then the big question I see for Oregon is, how is it seen as a place to do business? Right? Ultimately, when you're talking about large international sort of businesses, it's like, how are you seen as a place of business? And I think of when we looked at doing businesses around the world, we thought of a couple key factors. Number one, talent. I mean, ultimately, especially when you're talking about high tech, can you get the right talent there? And does the location have the capacity to train new talent? So education certainly is going to come in large there. And I think education is actually the solution to so many of the challenges facing our society today. Second, what sort of business environment is there? I'm going to talk about that in the last thing before I stop. And then cost to do business. Now, you can elect to be the lowest cost place to do business, but that's typically how emerging economies evolve. So it's okay not to be the lowest cost. So that means you're going to have the best talent, and you're going to have a nice business environment to go compete. And when you think about a business environment, I'm going to give one example because it was on that list. Singapore is an incredible country. An example of business-friendly environments, Singapore definitely has it, but they have incredibly strict environmental requirements. But when you're in a business in Singapore and you have to meet the requirements, you end up working with the government and getting that done. The government actually is there helping you achieve your goals, as opposed to being a police officer enforcing and checking and trying to make at times your life difficult. So I think it's kind of building on Patrick's and. I think you can have very stringent requirements in terms of business and what they need to do, but you also can be business friendly. And it's just about how do you create that environment. I think that's the greatest challenge when I think about Oregon, looking at building off its strengths, looking at those trends, and then creating a business environment that has a high bar, but also is business supportive.
Stephen, that's an interesting point that you raised. Sorry, Christian, I'm jumping in already. Did I interrupt you?
Go ahead.
An interesting point that we all raise. The other thing I'd like us to really think about is that this is a big state. And we have urban priorities, right? Suburban priorities where a lot of our manufacturing, large scale manufacturing businesses are located. And then we have really a lot of our most important heritage industries in the rural parts of the state that will be competing for natural resources that are required for large scale manufacturing or server farms. What's happening in Prineville, for example, with server farms there and water scarcity in places like Klamath Falls. So the other challenge, I think, in thinking about our long-term strategy will be to intentionally consider the varied economic, geographic, and natural resource distribution in the state. Unlike Singapore, we're big. We have a lot of varied differences and differences of interest, and we really need to unite the wild places, our rural areas with economic vitality and development in the central cities and suburbs. So really thinking about the scale of the state in order to drive scale of industry that will improve economic outcomes for the entire state will be really important. And that's a very challenging thing that as I look out for us all to remember that the most important drivers of our economy really are actually in our rural spaces. Right? When we talk about the beautiful natural landscape, Portland is a nice city, but what we're really talking about is Mount Hood, right? And then east of the mountain. So that's another big challenge that we have that some of the city states that are really effective at driving economic growth don't have.
I just want to underline this line of thinking, Rakaya, because I think it's exactly about identifying how the state is different, what are its unique circumstances, and building on that. That doesn't mean there is an easy solution, because there, exactly as you pointed out, there are these trade-offs, and politics is often about competing interests and how do we deal with that. But I think it's starting to kind of recognize what is it that makes us different, and how does that allow us to compete, in different ways in that Industry 4.0 and global economy that Stephen outlined. You don't have the urban centers, of Singapore or San Francisco or other places. So you're not attractive for the type of activities that necessarily want to be there, but you can do something different. I want to focus a little bit on I think what all three of you mentioned, that's this need to increasingly find the right solutions in the end. We need growth and sustainability. We need growth and inclusion. And I think that's a discussion that will be with us for quite a while. Here in Sweden, you've heard about Greta Thunberg and you've seen her feed it around the world. There are a lot of people that say, no, it's not about and, it's only about climate change, and growth doesn't matter to us. I don't think that's a sustainable solution either. But we need to understand that this opinion is out there, and I think we need to find solutions that actually combine these. The same, I think, with inclusion. I think there are concerns about minorities in the U.S., about rising inequality. I think there are also enough people that say, this is the primary issue that we need to focus on. Again, I believe we can only do that if we also generate growth. But it means that we really look at our growth mechanisms. For example, if you look at clusters, what are the industries that actually provide jobs? And not just for the PhDs, that have a specific profile in terms of their ethnic background, their education, and so on, but rural areas, people that come from a different background. So I think one has to at least be mindful in the growth strategy on how we combine these different goals rather than only seeing them as a trade-off. But it is hard. This requires really a lot of ingenuity and innovation.
Yeah, well, on the topic of how Oregon is uniquely positioned to compete and what assets we do have, I think, building on what Rakaya said, we are a large and diverse state with natural resource areas and, not San Francisco or Singapore, but an urban, creative urban area. And, that's oftentimes pointed to as, a risk or a liability for us. And I do think it's an opportunity. We, both because of the diversity of assets, but also because clearly we're facing, a national crisis of division in many ways. And that is an impediment to economic growth and also social prosperity. And so, I do think the fact that we've got this diverse kind of living environments and economic situations could be an asset for us if we can find a way to pull it together. And I wonder, kind of thinking about the panel, I wonder, Rakaya, if there's an important role for capital to play in that, to bridging that situation, and while leveraging the variety of assets, or Steve, if there's a way for technology, an important role for technology to play in bringing us together across these different assets and communities, and then Christian, so whoever wants to take this, but I wish I had hours to speak to each of you about this, but Christian, I'm wondering, we talk a lot about transitions are the issue, right? So that when there's technology transitions, population transitions, or one thing we've talked a lot about here, workforce transitions, training the workforce of the future, the jobs are different. Steve referenced this. Are there models for making that investment in a complex political, public, private, economic situation where it's hard to align everybody around a common long-term goal? So anyway, I don't know if any of that sparked some thoughts, but I do think this is an opportunity for us as well as a challenge.
Well, you definitely have.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Go ahead, Stephen. I'll be quiet for a minute.
Okay, so I'll just again, I'll kind of bring a little bit of a tech perspective here. I think technology is such a great enabler. I know spending time on the 4.0 I brought up is a bit of a fear of like, is it going to be a good thing or bad thing ultimately, right? And every industrial revolution has seen that, where people fear, because jobs do go away and they do change. But at the same point in time, in every example, it actually enhanced the society and actually created greater prosperity and wealth. Now, not necessarily as equal as we would like to see. So I think for the farmer out in Central Oregon, technology is going to have as big of an impact on them as it is for the scientists out in Hillsboro. And I just think, and without going a little bit to solution here, I just think education is such the great enabler that that every industry will be touched by kind of technology, and every industry will be changed by technology. But a state like Oregon, by embracing that and emphasizing things like, education is one of them, can really help the community kind of go through that change in a productive way. Jobs will change, but they're not going to go away. And as much as technology can do, there's a lot of things technology will not be able to do in the foreseeable future. The ability of humans to problem solve, the ability of humans to be able to use their hands, their minds in a way to go and take on complicated problems, it just won't go away. So by being able to embrace the future, embrace kind of education for all in the community, that won't solve the problems overnight, but I just think it's going to be so empowering for that society the next 10 or 20 years, and that's kind of what we're looking at in the Oregon Business Plan.
Stephen, I agree with that. And in my world, the world of capital, we frame this thinking a little bit differently. You would say educating the population is important. I would say investing in human capital is our top priority. So most people, when they think of capital, they think about financial capital, but that's only one form of many. We have natural capital, which we've described as our beautiful environment. There's synthetic capital, how much credit we have, how we use it, how effectively we use it to drive growth. And so I would say that there probably is a whole area of thinking about the various forms of capital that the state brings to bear. But I agree, Stephen, that investing in the best trained and most flexible workforce in the world will generate economic activity, right? Investing in human capital would be the first step. The second step, I would say, for the contributions that capital can make to our long-term success is the alignment of capital to drive growth. What we find is if we're not thoughtful about the ways that public money, which is a form of capital, meets private money, will all jam into the same part of the risk spectrum or jam into the same tasks. And so we also need a rationalization and an understanding of the spectrum of where our various forms of capital can go, and have a quarterback to say, hey, public capital, you go long on human investments. Private capital, we need you to carry us in the intermediate term to take risk with private enterprise. Federal money, we need you in the short term to help us with small business capital, to help keep folks working, because we know that small businesses drive our economy here. So I think we need a capital quarterback or a capital plan to really help us understand the ways that our wealth can be brought to bear for our collective benefit. I'm really excited about the prospect of really thinking deeply about how we can do that together.
Let me maybe build a little bit on this optimism, because I do think we're at the moment in time where people are quite frustrated. I mean, there is the pandemic, the economic situation looks pretty bad, not only short term, but, we were already in a period of slowing productivity growth, and, trend growth was going down. Not only in the US, the political divisions, only seem to be growing. We seem to have a hard time even talking to each other. But I think what I'm hearing from you and what I see in the Oregon Business Council is really there is an opportunity here to work together in different ways, recognizing that there are really hard problems ahead, but also be clear that we actually do have a lot of assets. Our human capital, Stephen, the technology, there's so much technology now available for us to solve these type of issues. So I think maybe the starting point is, not to lose the optimism, or maybe also the confidence that actually, if we work together, we can move forward. There is no one big solution. It's probably a lot of smaller steps that we have to take, but that always requires collaboration and maybe in new ways that didn't exist before.
It feels.
Sorry, go ahead, Rakai.
Well, building on that optimism, right? There are so many reasons to be negative, but it does feel like, at least in the United States, or in this part of the United States, that we're in a growth period. A period of understanding each other better, a period of understanding that we have to work together more effectively, realizing that we have these really serious challenges ahead of us, and the only way to deal with them is collectively. So it feels like we're in this moment of transformation. Growth is nonlinear, and we're in a steep learning curve right now. It hurts a little, but it also feels like we are capable of facing the challenges.
Yeah, I agree. I see it in the same optimistic way, and I think that while we have just talked a lot about the fact that we have the assets, we're an in-migration state, lots of great human capital, we've got natural resource assets. I think while the Oregon Business Plan has served as a great platform for these types of discussions, what I'm hoping, and I think we need to create out of this, and I'm hoping comes out of this, is more catalysts. Rukai, you talked about a quarterback for capital. We need more catalysts and venues that cause that kind of really difficult how work that Christian to come together. And I'm hoping that, with the call for social change that's been so prevalent in our cities here, importantly, that the economic crisis that the virus has created for so many people, that these things all will cause us to come together in a little bit more, with a little bit more unity, and think about what those venues and catalysts are that cause us to dig into the how and to get the problem solved and create opportunity out of these resources we have. I think there's a lot of alignment around what we want to happen and what we want the outcomes to be, and it's one thing that's really sticking with me from what you said, Christian. The how is the really hard part, and I'm hoping that this environment creates that kind of catalyst for the how.
Whoa, that was outstanding. I want to thank our panelists and Christian Ketels for the commentary on strategy and growth, and so much to think about, so many opportunities ahead of us. And is really the underlying opportunity there is when you start to think about growth, you start to think about opportunity. You really can't do that without the words of innovation and entrepreneurship. And as we stage that growth and as we think about our future, I think those two words will be critical as we look ahead. So to talk more about why innovation and entrepreneurship will be key to our future and what Oregon can be doing to build an advantage in this area, I want to welcome two of Oregon's brightest, Kanth Golpapur and Carol Dahl. Kanth is an entrepreneur and investor, chair of the Business Oregon Commission and co-chair of the state's Futures Commission. And a group of thought leaders from different industry sectors around the state tasked with developing a comprehensive innovation strategy for Oregon. And Carol is the executive director of Lemelson Foundation and a member of the Futures Commission. So with that, welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us on our third series. And let's start with you, Kanth. What does innovation mean to you, and why do you think it's so important?
Sure. Thanks for having us. I really appreciate it. For me, I've got a pretty bland definition of innovation. It's basically when you come up with an idea or a process that either solves a problem or creates a new opportunity. But at the end of the day, innovation has to provide value for the producer of the good or service. I'm more interested as to why it's important for us, especially today. The only constant in the world today is change. And regardless of which industry you're in, you could be in a very traditional heritage industry or you could be in high tech. Everything is changing. And I believe it plays a really leading role in reducing economic inequities. If you take a look at the economy today, it's being concentrated more and more in fewer companies. And that's not very good because these companies have a vested interest in preserving the status quo. For their innovation, and they don't have a desire to innovate. This may be a little extreme, but it's almost like the feudal system of old, where you have power in the hands of a few, and the rest just serve those powerful ones. And ultimately, this isn't good for democracy, because as you'll recall, a lot of feudal systems did lead to violent revolutions. So, as we plan for the next 5 to 10 years, we should also look ahead to the next 50, 100 years and decide what kind of a society we want to have here. I want to make clear, I'm not calling for a redistribution of wealth, but it's just the enabling of a level playing field where new ideas and products can flourish regardless of one's race, gender, or religion. This will really spur innovation in all sectors of the economy and improve the overall well-being. And it's only then can you get economic justice, because I think once you get economic justice, you get social and racial justice as well. So for me, innovation is a really key driver in all those elements.
Carol, how about you?
Yeah, great. So representing the Lemelson Foundation has had a mission of improving lives through invention for our 25 years, and that includes in our home state of Oregon. And if you think about invention, right, you need the innovation process, which takes that idea and reduces it to practice and turns it into the reality of a product that a business can deliver on in terms of value. So as you look at our news headlines every day, I think they call out why invention and innovation are important. We need to rebuild a resilient economy. That was talked about really effectively in the last session. We need to create high quality jobs for more members of our communities, emphasis on more members of our communities, which Kanth just touched on. But we also have some really big societal and environmental challenges, and those require invention and innovation to create the products that will be the solutions. And that's not least of which the pandemic, which we find ourselves in right now, clearly needs some solutions and invention and innovation, but also things like climate change. So it's important that because invention and innovation yield new products, those products are, and the businesses associated with them are the engines of the economy. These types of businesses also disproportionately create high quality jobs, and they also create the solutions to these challenges that we face going forward. So in short, I would say that invention and innovation are key to the future we want, whether it's here in Oregon, in our nation, or globally.
Thank you. You know, I was listening to a podcast this weekend about the importance of innovation in the small businesses, and how important the small business and the innovators are to our economic engine, and reminded of the role that they play. So, you know, so important in so many ways to be catalysts. So great. All right, second question, Carol. Let's go back to you with this. So how do we build a functioning ecosystem to support I&E in Oregon?
Yeah, so we've been working in this space for about 25 years as a foundation, and during that time, we've really been taking a look at what promotes invention and innovation, and we see that it's a complex set of interconnected elements and pathways. You know, the invention ecosystem includes the innovation pathway, and that was talked about quite a bit in the first session, things where you have elements that are required for the innovator, the entrepreneur, to take their idea into a product that will realize the kind of benefits we just talked about. And that means they need access to capital, access to physical spaces, access to mentors who are experienced, can help them through that pathway. And that's the thing we usually talk about when we talk about innovation, how to stimulate it. But it's also clear that you need the people. That came up in the last discussion as well. You need the people who have the ideas, the inventions that create the new ideas for businesses, et cetera. But also you need the talent pool to actually fill the opportunity space in those new businesses that come forward. So to do that, you need what we think of as an inventor pathway or an innovator pathway that consists of elements that include in and out of school experiences that cultivate the ability for people to recognize their creative potential, their ability to actually become entrepreneurial and to take things forward. So together, those two pathways, which are deeply interdependent and really interrelated, need to be cultivated to get the outcomes you want. Now, there's a bit of nuance here because clearly, while education is lagging right now and we're struggling with the effects of the pandemic and also funding opportunities for education going forward, we also need to realize that the approach may need to change significantly in order to capture the full value of the population in terms of innovation and creativity. So skills like creativity, innovation, resilience in the face of failure, the ability to identify and solve problems, work in teams, etc., are all skill sets and mindsets we need to cultivate with our students. Currently, we're also not ensuring that we're capturing all the valuable intellectual capital of the human resource we have in the state, so it's not reaching all kids. So girls, kids of color, kids coming out of low-income communities, rural communities, they're not being prepared in the same way, having the same opportunity, invitation to the innovation economy table that, you know, affluent white boys are getting. And so we need to change that experience so we can capture that value. Our partners have found that the experience of inventing and innovating and being exposed to the concepts of entrepreneurship are really transformational for kids. Can change their whole perspective on the next opportunity that they have in front of them and cultivate those mindsets I talked about. And so that's an important point, that educational piece. The second piece is the innovation pathway is not in any way equally accessible right now for women, people of color, people coming from low-income communities, and once again from distributed geography, so outside the Portland metro area. So we need to embrace changes and approaches in both our teaching solutions, but also making that innovation pathway more inclusive to really capture the full capital advantage of the human capital we have here in the state.
And Kanta, can you maybe expand on that?
Sure. Yeah, I'd like to piggyback a lot of what Carol said. Absolutely, education is one of the key components, is the foundation upon which all of this rests. But the other thing, which I also think we need to, and again, when I take a look at Oregon, we need to really encourage a culture of innovation, entrepreneurship, and risk-taking. We need to encourage people to take risks. We can provide all the education, but if we don't have a culture which fosters risk-taking and saying it's okay to fail, we're not going to be successful in every endeavor, but it's okay to fail. Failure should not be held against you. So we need to encourage that risk-taking culture, which I think is really a key component to innovate. And then we need to make sure the state government supports policies like that and then creates the right set of tools and infrastructure to enable this. This will then, set up the right atmosphere for the private sector to step in what the state can do is provide the ecosystem, but it's really up to the private sector to step in and then innovate on top of that. And it's, as long as it's okay to take risks and okay to fail, and what the Futures Commission is also working on right now, what we're trying to do is we've gathered thought leaders from across the state, spanning all economic sectors, because this has to reach all sectors of the state and all economies. And so for me, I think that's really cool. You take education, you take varies from the capital, and then you foster a culture of risk taking and make it acceptable to fail. And I think that will lead us down the right path.
Is there an example of where that's working well today?
I think there are several places where it is okay to fail. Like, take Silicon Valley is a great example. Take Israel as a great example. Again, it's and what I do see over here is it's when risk taking happens is when you get people from all economic segments and demographics in one segment. You have this melting pot, and I think that where I see this work best is where there's a huge melting pot. Take Singapore, take Hong Kong, where you bring various cultures with various inputs. And that's what I think really fosters the spirit of risk-taking and innovation.
Great, thank you. So tell us a little bit more about the Futures Commission, Carol, and why is this work so important and exciting? And what are some of the big issues the Commission's focusing on?
Yeah, so I first of all would say I'm really pleased to be serving on the Futures Commission. We're very committed to, stimulating the work here in Oregon, and so this is a real opportunity for us to participate, which I'm excited about. I will leave it to Cons to actually tell more about the Commission itself, but I did want to highlight three things I see as a member of the Commission that I think are particularly exciting and forward-looking in terms of the approach that's being taken. First of all, I think there's a real opportunity because we're taking a 10-year view to take a systems view, and I think we heard in the opening session today how important it is to not just focus on one small element in the innovation pathway, but actually think about, what are the full sets of things. So I think there's a real opportunity to step back and say, how do we both cultivate the talent as well as those businesses and ensure that the supporting environment is there for both sides of the equation? The second thing is that I think taking a systems view will give us a chance to step back and reflect on how do we actually make sure that it's an inclusive environment. And so are we actually engaging the full value of the human capital we have here in the state? And so engaging people across the state, both outside the Portland metro area and into the other regions, as well as across the demographics of our state. And the third thing is, it's really a chance to take a longer term view. I know that we're all really challenged right now by the pandemic, and so the immediate response is, of course, to deal with mapping a path to recovery. But because we're taking a 10-year view, I think we can also think about that recovery in terms of how to build long-term resilience and thinking beyond short-term fixes, which means we can really begin to change some of those fundamental things in the system that will leave us stronger for future opportunities, but also for future challenges that we might face as a state. So I want to also end kind of my comments on this by saying kudos to Kant and the other organizers, because I just want to repeat that they've brought together a terrific set of people from across the state who represent all kinds of elements from within that innovation ecosystem. And I think it really provides an opportunity for us to create real value for the state in terms of looking forward around that 10-year plan.
And we are really fortunate to have Carol and her time as well, in addition to all the thought leaders like Carol mentioned from really across the state and all sectors, which I think is really important, because at the end of the day, this has to be distributed. It can't be concentrated in just Portland or the I-5 corridor. It's got to reach all parts of the state. So when we look out, 10 years from now, some of the things we've heard before, but I want to stress it again because it's really important. One is a really robust education system. And it's got to encompass all demographics, and that's adapted to the needs of a rapidly changing economy. The economy is going to change. We know that. The second one is workforce retraining, which I think is really important. Keep in mind, 90% of today's workforce is still going to be here 10 years from now. And what we do know is that the technologies are going to change pretty dramatically, regardless of which sector you're in. So we need to provide enough resources for them to be trained and retrained to the new technologies. Another key component is multi-generational wealth creation. We need to do this so that citizens then can have the wherewithal to take risks, the risks which I mentioned, which is really key for innovation, and come up with innovative ideas and products. And then look at what our natural strengths are. I can point to food and agriculture, apparel, sectors. But underlying all of this, technology is going to underpin all of these areas. So we need to make sure we make the right investments in human capital, which can span all these sectors. It really is about an ideas economy. It's not about the forest economy or the semiconductor. It's about ideas and how you get those, bring those ideas to fruition. And then climate change. A lot of people look at that as a challenge. I, being an entrepreneur, had to look at that as a huge opportunity. I think we're well positioned, and we have some inherent advantages over here, and we can positively impact all sectors of the economy as well as all regions of the state. And we can do well by doing good. It sounds like a cliche, but I really think we have a huge opportunity over here, and we need to make sure that we take that by the hand and come up with the right set of policies and a good set of recommendations. This is what I'm hoping the Futures Commission can come up with. We're a bunch of really bright, smart people together. And I know with getting all this together, we can go back to the governor's office and the legislature and come up with a set of policies and recommendations, which hopefully we can get implemented and bring Oregon on the right path again. We've got a lot of challenges, but I think a lot of those challenges can be overcome because what we do have is human capital. And I think we need to really nourish and unleash that.
Excellent. Listen, thank you both for participating on the panel today and being part of our series this fall. It sounds like the work the Futures Commission is working on is so similar, and I think that to what the Oregon Business Plan is focused on, and I think that in a lot of ways in Oregon we have a lot of people who are aligned, but sometimes don't get a chance to work together to build a more of a powerful voice. And I think this is our chance now to bring some smart people together and do that. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for the leadership that you're providing. And I'm sure we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's be here.
All right, I want to thank Carol and Kanth for joining us from the Futures Commission. That was they're doing some great work and feels so spot on with the 10-year vision that we're putting together. So I'd like to turn to a focus on entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship of color. And one reason entrepreneurship is going to be key to the future is because we know it can be an important path to economic mobility for so many. But we also know we have major barriers to block that path for many people of color. I'd like to invite Monica Anand, CEO of Zapproved, Ernesto Fonseca, CEO of Hacienda CDC. Sorry, I lost my place. And James Allen Parker, Executive Director of the Oregon Native American Chamber, to chat about what we can collectively be doing to eliminate the unique challenges people of color face when starting, owning, and scaling a business in Oregon. Welcome to the three of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Josh. This is such an important issue, and it's one that I think is going to be key to an equitable recovery as we dig out of the hole we're in. Before we start to, I think we talked as a panel and we decided it was important to put this discussion in some context. All businesses are small at some point. According to the 2018 Small Business Administration report, 99% of business activity in Oregon is small business. And it's been small businesses and entrepreneurs that have been primarily suffered as a result of the pandemic and the subsequent shutdown orders. At this point, it's no secret that entrepreneurs of color have been the hardest hit by the pandemic, and we've talked about that a bit. The barriers erected by systemic racism mean that their businesses have, on average, less access to cash reserves, have a harder time establishing credit to help through hard times, and tend to face greater challenges than white-owned businesses when preparing the paperwork to make them eligible for public service contracts. All while businesses of all size benefited tremendously from federal programs like the PPP, it is also true that BIPOC businesses, especially small businesses, did not benefit fully from this program as their white-owned counterparts did. We're actually going to have a panel or a conversation with Robert Smith after the lunch break, and I invite you to tune in to talk about specifically Black-owned businesses at that time. But I'm really excited to be joined by these wonderful panelists, Ernesto and James. And I've, some research indicates that 1 out of every 7 small businesses nationwide have permanently closed, even despite the PPP and other lifelines. And now the recovery is slowing. And as we enter colder months, an additional federal support is uncertain. So with this in mind, I'd like to ask James and Ernesto to introduce themselves briefly and give their thoughts on the challenges facing small businesses in Oregon. I'll start with James.
Thank you so much. My name is James Allen Parker. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Chippewa Cree Tribal Nation and the executive director of the Oregon Native American Chamber. And as tribal people, we work on different time scales. And when we think about our work and we think about not just our individual work, but the work that needs to be accomplished over a series of generations. Our people have endured centuries of horrific and catastrophic challenges, yet through these challenges, our sense of what is true is never lost. And before we talk about the landscape, I'd like to continue to ground our work with some historical perspective. 200 years ago, we didn't have our people living in poverty. None of us were houseless. All of our children had access to culturally responsive education. And in a larger time scale, for thousands of years, trade and commerce was a vital part of the economy of the Pacific Northwest. A network of trade routes, including the Columbia River Trade Network, connected our nations and communities and individuals, resulting in prosperity and opportunity for tribal people from around the Pacific Northwest region. Fast forward to today, and for example, in Portland, the metro area is home to over 70,000 Native Americans from over 380 tribes, including those of the original inhabitants here. And many of our people are disproportionately face disparities in health, education, income, and wealth. And now we're facing the pandemic. And so we here at ONAC have intentionally used this time to listen and respond across our entrepreneur network and to organize and mobilize with our sister chamber organizations that are also embedded in communities of color. Together, we have begun this work toward a larger vision of prosperity for our communities. So I just wanted to provide some context. I'd love for Ernesto to jump in and then maybe we can dive into the question.
Sounds great.
Yeah, thank you very much, James. Well, on the immigrant Latino side, I want to say that we've been here for a very, very long time, just like Native Americans have. We're part of the country, and the Latino community is a very, very diverse community. All the way from Argentina up to Mexico, and including the United States, that has a really large and robust Latino community of many different backgrounds. Our struggles have been slightly different, nonetheless, just as challenging as many of the other challenges that the different communities of colors face. We a great majority of us come as immigrants, which poses challenges on itself, from having our kids being caged right now as we speak at the border, including in the state of Washington, to being harassed, by police as well as immigration services. Also, all of these issues compounded with the inability to do business fully documented, if I may say that, which means that puts us into a category of unregulated businesses and brings another set of challenges: access to capital being completely documented, legal in this country, being a citizen as a Latino it's already challenging enough. Putting more and more barriers, it's our immigration status. And a great portion of our communities, over 11 million people in this country, live under those shadows. And unfortunately, that keeps them from moving forward. And that affects the entire community of the United States. In the state of Oregon, about 12 to 14% of the entire state is Latino, with some cities, including Woodburn, Cornelius, Milton, all of those cities have populations of over 50% of Latinos occupying those spaces, most of them very low-income Latinos with very little opportunity for education opportunities or economic mobility, upward mobility. That's just a really broad snapshot of what Latinos look like in the state of Oregon across the United States. However, entrepreneurship has been a very, very significant part of our survival. Some of us are not that much entrepreneurs, but when we are put into a position of not being able to find employment, when we are in a position of being able to receive any kind of services for whatever reasons those are, primarily immigration, we are forced to start our own businesses. And that is a good thing in so many cases. Some of us, are better at going at school. Some of us probably are better at being employees and or being administrators. But when those options are not on the table, being an entrepreneur becomes the only option. And that option has played a significant part in the development of this country, whether it's by choice or by force. The great majority of businesses in this country are started by immigrants and by people of color, whether it's Native Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, or Latinos. They are started by us. Therefore, I think it is important for us to continue to pay a strong attention to what we're doing so we can build a better future together.
Well, thank you for that important context and perspective. But keeping in mind all the uncertainty ahead with the recovery and lots of businesses already closed, what specifically can Oregon do collectively? Like, what can Oregon do to support struggling small businesses right now in the uncertainty? James, do you want to take a shot at that?
Sure. At ONAC, we keep kind of returning to one central question. What are the supports we need available to our enterprises that really call into existence vibrant and thriving travel communities of the future? And as we work with our partners on building those supports today, and one of those things is providing forums such as this to better providing critical information to better inform public policy and programming decisions. If we kind of zoom out and take a macroscopic view of the supportive landscape that kind of reimagines an economy that serves local needs, really it's operationalized by activating what is kind of referred to as targeted universalism. It's really the idea of setting universal goals pursued by targeted process to achieve those goals. It's within that framework that we can really engage equity process for better outcomes for all of us. And one example of what Oregon has done recently was within the response to the pandemic. Business Oregon offered a grant program that really kind of targeted through this broad array of an understanding of what that landscape looks like to ensure that the underserved and underrepresented and communities of color were actually, those dollars were intended to reach those communities with metrics and a process to accomplish that. When we kind of look at more pragmatic solutions, as Ernesto said, capital access. I mean, how do we call into in existence state-backed mechanisms to ensure lending at non-predatory rates to the underserved, underrepresented, Native, Black, Indigenous, and communities of color, to those who are unbanked or lightly banked, often through no fault of their own. So getting resources to entrepreneurs who we should and will not leave out of any recovery going forward. And then you pair capital access with technical assistance, but technical assistance that's culturally responsive and community focused, with providers who understand the difficulties of owning and operating a business on or near reservation, who understand the common challenges so many of us in our urban communities face. And I'd say finally, let's explore the power of Oregon to be its own stimulus in 2021 and forward. How can Oregon dollars stay as local as possible, focusing on small business with intentional and clear mandates for agencies to meet for contracting with Native, Black, Indigenous, and communities of color? This is our own economic driver, and that economic development must be part of community build, not thought of as a separate process.
Yeah.
That's great. Ernesto?
Yeah, very well said, James. You know, I want to add a little bit more to what you already said, but you cover a really good portion of some of the same issues that we're facing. And this is just another example that, you know, even though we're very diverse communities within Native American, Indigenous, Black, and Latinos, we continue to share same and many of the same struggles when it comes to access to capital and education to be successful. Some of the things that the way I tend to analyze this kind of information and circumstances is by understanding some of the external forces, you know, racism, inequality, and the informality of the way we develop our businesses. That is, when you look at these issues in practice, we can see that we have less access to credit. You know, we don't understand really how credit works in this country. And therefore, you know, that tends to affect us very, very strongly. I was chatting with a couple of our friends in Mexico, in which we have Mexicans and Japanese working in the same company in Mexico. And there's a separation because both of these cultures understand formality and the way of doing business under very different lenses. With the Japanese culture, generally speaking, obviously, being much more focused and quiet when it comes to accomplishing their goals. And the Latino-Mexican culture being a little more loud, we are, and a little more informal. Yes, we're going to get it done, you know, 1 hour later, doesn't matter. It happens. And I know that I'm simply stereotyping many of the things that we do, but generally speaking, it works like that. So not understanding how serious the credit system works in this country and how much is going to be affecting you is one big issue that we have. Also, the banking system offers a tremendous amount of barriers for us to be able to open an account or to have that access to capital. Not to mention that when you are looking into the different statistics speaking, the different access to capital, when I get a loan, you know, my loan is going to be much more expensive than that loan that is going to be allocated to a white organization. And that is for exactly the same. You know, we have done significant research with NCRC, and they have noted over and over again that we are treated differently. Our access to capital is different. Our interest rates are higher. And all of these are based on subjective assumptions that we won't be able to succeed or to accomplish as much as the others, you know, can. What can we do about this whole thing? You know, one of the things that James mentioned is obviously access to capital, but coupled with cultural responsive technical assistance. The partnership between the big companies and the small companies, something that I've been talking about consistently, is something that other states already do. So some larger companies, whether it's Nike or whether it's Intel, whatever it is, they are, you know, they should be allocating some resources to purchase from smaller companies and smaller businesses. With that said, also they should couple these businesses with some level of mentorship that we don't have. The big differences that we have and the issues that we have is because we don't understand each other in many, many different concerns. And for me, you know, understanding each other and sharing that way of doing business within the different organizations, the different groups of people, will be very significant for us to accomplish more and better. When you look at the statistics of, you know, Latinos growing in this country, we are growing at a really fast pace. Our population is growing and growing, and if anybody, all they see is these numbers, you know, coming strong, they should be very concerned that if we don't nurture and prepare this new generation of Latinos and people of color in general to be successful, the entire country is going to suffer. I'm going to stop there because we only have a few minutes left, but Monica and James, your thoughts?
Well, thank you. I think the highlighting that you're doing on the banking system and the discrimination that you face and the bias that we face in the banking system is really important. As well as in my own business, even in the best of times, entrepreneurs and businesses led by people of color face unique barriers to scaling up or starting up. And a mentorship has been a big part of what I've benefited from in scaling my business. James, I'd love to ask you kind of how do you think about, Ernesto talked about the partnership between the government, businesses, communities. How do you think about those different roles there, and how do you think about working together?
Well, I think that was really good comments, and I look at kind of the common struggles that our communities of color face, and realize that we're walking like pathways within the same shared experience. And so, when you talk about the role of government and really we're talking about policy, I think right now, we just have to have an honest discussion about it. Right now would be incorrect to say that the current economic system is failing us. That's because it wasn't really designed to serve Native people. The reality of the economic structure we're living in today has been completely designed to dispossess tribal people of wealth and the ability to care for ourselves and our communities. Now, with this understanding and knowing how public policy played out and continues to play a major role in creating the inequalities that make our communities and businesses much more vulnerable to this crisis. I mean, decades of policies and practices have cemented inequality into our institutions. And so regardless of individual intent, without deliberate invention, these institutions often produce inequitable outcomes. Public policy must now continue to play a role in rectifying these injustices. And I think when we look at that, we have to realize it's not enough to be complicit or sidelined, that we really need people in these spaces and places who act deliberate in their anti-racist, anti-colonial mindset, and understand that what we're up against is structures that we really need, kind of continued work on.
Yeah,
That's an excellent point. I think your point about it's not broken, it's working exactly as intended, and this is how it was designed is critical for people to kind of absorb and understand as a starting point. And I think, and I'll ask you both, but as white allies that are watching this panel, what would you ask them? I think, James, you kind of hit on truth telling, and that there's a truth telling that you want to have happen. At least I think that's what I heard from you. Ernesto, what do you think, a white ally who's watching? What would you ask for the one thing?
I would like, for anyone that has the possibility to work with us to start enabling policies that will help us move this forward, access and formalizing the informal businesses so they can have access to those tax incentives and have access to those tax benefits that can, by declaring this money, it brings some benefits to the future. Helping, small business to become clusters. So a bunch of little businesses making boxes for the big companies, gives a lot of power, purchasing as well as selling. Obviously, having a line of credit, within the state or the city of whatever, and having organizations that truly work for us, whether it's Latino chambers, Native American chambers that work together to advance these policies and give us a voice on the table so we can speak for ourselves and speak at the legislature and the state level so we can enable these policies and make them consistent. So, formalizing, bring these clusters, financing, access to capital, all of those things are significant, important with that particular cultural lens.
Well, thank you so much, Ernesto and James. You guys brought up so many important things. And I think especially about empathy, understanding each other, working together. Real change takes many, action on the part of many. So thank you so much. And I will again say that after the lunch break, we've got a conversation to continue this conversation with Robert Smith. So thank you. I'll turn it back to John.
Thank you.
Thank you, panel. Another great discussion to wrap up our morning on shared prosperity. And just as a reminder, our theme here is shared prosperity, and I think we heard a lot this morning from all aspects of that conversation, and today's focus on reviving economy and strengthening it as an engine of opportunity for all. And I think no better way to wrap that than the conversation we just had. So this morning, I want to thank Christian Ketels, all the way from Stockholm, Sweden, and his conversation that led to a great panel with Stephen and Patrick and Rukaya. Then we heard from Carol and Kanth, and regarding the Futures Commission and the work that they're doing that will align very well with the 10-year plan that we're working on for shared prosperity. And then finally from Monica, James, and Ernesto on the opportunity and support of entrepreneurs of color, and leaning in by all of us to make and improve actually that system of opportunity. So with that being said, I think we wrap up a very strong morning of conversation, topic, and some very high-level people from around our state. And I look forward, as Monica mentioned, after the break, which will come back right at 1 o'clock, we'll be joined by Robert Smith, and Monica will have a nice conversation with him that just will kind of build and cap off what's already been a great morning. So thank you to everybody who's joining us. I encourage you to set your alarm and be ready and be back by 1 o'clock, as you won't want to miss the last part of our program today. So thanks again, and enjoy your break. May have made a quick run to a U.S. bank or a Bank of America, or others might have watched some video of the Portland Trailblazers, or you might have made a run to Dutch Bros, and those were all shameless sponsor plugs as part of our business plan. So thank you for coming back. I hope you had a nice break and enjoyed that time. Without further ado, honestly, I'm very excited about this next portion that kind of brings us home for the day. And really, I'm just going to introduce Monica and let her take it away, and let her tell you a little bit about our great next speaker. Monica, off to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jock. Hello, Robert.
Hey, Monica, how are you?
I'm great. And I have the great privilege today of introducing Robert Smith. Robert is the founder, chairman, and CEO of Vista Equity Partners. Vista currently manages over $58 billion and oversees a portfolio of over 60 enterprise software companies. In the interest of full disclosure, Zapproved, my company, is one of the companies in the Vista Equity portfolio. But it turns out that Zapproved and the many other Oregon companies that Vista has invested in is not Robert's only connection to Oregon. I recently joined the Oregon Investment Council and found out that the Oregon Pension Fund has been invested in Vista funds for over a decade. When I asked the team of amazing investment professionals we have at the Treasury, they said, and I'll quote them, Vista has been one of the Oregon Treasury's largest and strongest performing manager relationships. Robert, as you know, the pension fund is critical for our state, so thank you very much for the great returns you've delivered for Oregonians. It is our pleasure. Well, by now you all in the audience might be thinking that I'm biased in telling you about Robert. So from here on out, I'm not going to ask you to take my word for it on all of his many accomplishments. Last month, Time magazine chose Robert as one of the 100 most influential people of 2020. The write-up for Time was written by one of my favorite actors, Samuel L. Jackson, and his wife and Tony Award-nominated actress, LaTanya Richardson Jackson. So I want to read to you what they wrote about Robert. Robert F. Smith is perhaps the savviest investor in America today. But even while recognizing his impressive record of success, his most important investments over the years have been in people. Last year, Smith instantly granted hundreds of young Black men the ability to pursue their aspirations when he donated $34 million to the Morehouse College class of 2019 so they could graduate debt-free. He also gave to the United Negro College Fund to increase educational opportunities for underrepresented students of color. And earlier this year, he lobbied tirelessly to secure relief for thousands of minority-owned small businesses. Through his efforts, Congress earmarked $10 billion for institutions that support investment in lower-income urban and rural communities. Robert F. Smith has keenly recognized, this was Samuel L. Jackson writing, and his wife writing, Robert F. Smith has keenly recognized that the most important way to use wealth and considerable resources is to reinvest in people and their communities, societies, and futures. If we can perpetuate this priority, we just may have a shot at creating a better world for future generations. Well, Robert, that's high praise, but well deserved. I realized that if I tried to read off all of your awards for philanthropy, we wouldn't be able to talk to you in this 20 minutes. So I decided to go with that. And
That's great.
You couldn't be a more appropriate speaker for our series. So thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure.
I want to ask you what your view is on how our economy, I know you spend a lot of time thinking about this, so what do you think the economy is going to look, how is it going to look different after the pandemic? And what are the opportunities and challenges that it creates maybe specifically for a place like Oregon as we plan to go forward?
Yeah, and again, thank you, Monica, for inviting me. Delighted to see you. Can't wait to see you in person soon. I know we have our CXO summit now, and we're doing it virtually. And it's like all things, we're learning a new equilibrium of engagement, which we all have to embrace. It's interesting. I have the great fortune of working with various states to help think about what this new equilibrium now looks like. In Oregon, as you know, we've got 31 portfolio companies who have some form of operations. They are, of course, approved. I will say on this call is our favorite until I'm on another call. I have to say it someone else's. But and I think we've got close to 850 employees in the state. And one of the things that we have found in Oregon, in particular, it's a great place for finding talented people who have some proclivity for embracing STEM-related fields, which, of course, we're in the world of enterprise software. And as I spend time with various governors in the U.S., one of the things we're truly focused on is how do we and how do you, as a state, start to create the environment where STEM education is not an opportunity, but it is a priority. And part of that, of course, leads to ensuring that you have K through 12 and college programs that are embracing coding, STEM education, embracing as a community in the schools, leveraging technology, broadband infrastructure, so that in distance learning in this environment, to enable the capabilities of your state citizens to be more effective. One of the things we found, it's kind of interesting. We found that our production, and this, our production capacity of our developers is actually increasing this time of COVID. And I think a lot has to do with the fact that we, are no longer having to commute as long and go as far and go through what I call the friction of life. And so, that type of work you can often do in an environment where you can be more productive by not having to move around as much. But on the other side of it, we have to think about the creating places where there's, some relief from the fatigue of 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours at the screen. So what I've been encouraging a number of the governors and business workers to do is think about what is this new equilibrium, 6 months from now, more likely 9 or 12 months from now, and creating, someone used the word flexible work dynamics, but I would say efficient work dynamics, where you may not have as many people in the office as often, but you have to equip them with the capacity to do the work from home, which of course is, the tools, the systems, and the learning. And I think a lot of people forget about the importance of learning in ongoing education, especially in our world of technology and software. We've got to really invest in that infrastructure. We've got to invest in online learning. We've got to invest in group learning with our teams, because that's how we're going to advance. Monica, have to constantly think about leveraging, in our case, Vista Consulting Group, to bring in artificial intelligence and machine learning and robotic process automation into our development and product development dynamics. And I think it's going to be more essential for states and to think about how do they create the infrastructure, either through partnerships and or through universities or online and distance learning academies, to enable their citizenry to get on the forefront of the world that we are in, which is software and technology.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think that's critical, all the things you brought up, and I know the investment that you make, I see it all the time. It's interesting that you brought up broadband because, I'm having quite the day here. As you mentioned, the investment in education. We are having our executive conference with the CXO of Vista, and I spent the morning listening to Ibrahim Kendi and Brian Stevenson. So I'm quite energized here, as well as earlier today we had a panel discussion focused on BIPOC businesses. And, broadband really has the potential to create more inequality from where we already are. So I think that was really critical. But I do you've spent a lot of time on this and you continue to work on it. So I want to get your perspective about how people of color have been disproportionately impacted by both the pandemic and the ensuing economic crisis. The theme of the Oregon Business Plan, and I applaud them, all of us, applaud the business plan for taking on shared prosperity. So we've spent a lot of time here. And so I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Sure, and it's a great theme, and the great thing about it is you can actually do something about it in your own companies, and with the efforts that you can bring to your state and local government. The fact is, there's an income and a wealth disparity in the African American community versus white communities in America, that if you actually made up that disparity, that actually increases the GDP of America by about 7%, or about $2 trillion annually. So there's an economic imperative to make this happen. And we can start to decouple and unpack how do we make it happen. One of the most important things is obviously education. You have to deliver high quality education to all the citizenry of the United States. And so we have to be thoughtful about that in this day and age of COVID. We have to do that through distance learning, and one of your colleagues, obviously, Hardeep Gulati, who runs Power School for us, and he and his team have actually reached out and said, okay, look, for any school, and I think we've hit a couple in Oregon that don't have access to distance learning management systems, we're going to offer it free, until the end of the year, and literally we've increased our usership by about 2 million students in America since March. Well, as we did that work, we figured out in some of those communities, they also have a gap in broadband and a gap in devices. So we then partnered with, Michael Dell's team and also Satya's team up at Microsoft. And so now we have, device providers as well. And of course, we, partnered up with the AT&T and Verizon, T-Mobile, et cetera, to provide the connectivity. So what's neat is we're now seeing businesses saying, this is a problem I can solve. I can solve it in the communities that I care about, where my employees are and where folks are in the community, and they're putting energy and action against it. One of the more novel, and I think will have a huge impact, is Bank of America. Bank of America issued a bond 3 weeks ago called the Equity, Progress, Sustainability Bond. It's a $2 billion bond that they issued, and now they're directing those dollars towards some of these initiatives, broadband, putting money into the, tier 1, tier 2 minority depository institutions, supporting the, community development financial institutions, and call them the capillary banking system. And really and expanding what I'll call lending policies on housing, putting money into affordable housing. And they realized that they can actually do it by issuing these bonds. Well, now we have multiple corporations lining up. So I'm hopeful this time next year we'll be at $100 billion in these bonds issued that are going towards these issues. And as you create, economic viability in communities, it makes them safer, it makes the people more prosperous. They actually become better consumers, start taking out, of course, more leverage. And what that does is actually start to build a more sustainable and equitable society, which is what we all want at the end of the day. And you know this, Monica. The fact is, we've got global competition because of the proliferation of computing power that we didn't have 20 years ago. And so we have to enable every citizen in America to be an effective and productive citizen, contributing to the growth of our economy and the growth of businesses and jobs, et cetera. And the only way to do that is through education and creating access to what I call equitable access to resources.
Yeah, I know you've thought about this a lot, and I just want to share that earlier in the program we heard from Christian Ketels, and he talked about the need for both growth and sustainability, or growth and social justice. And I know that you're on the board of directors of the Business Roundtable, and that you all just embraced the stakeholder capitalism as opposed to the old shareholder capitalism that Milton Friedman would have espoused. How do the people listening, the Oregon Business Plan gets a lot of attendees that are both policymakers as well as business leaders. How do you think about that shift and how we work together and really that change to stakeholder capitalism? And what would you say to somebody who says we can't have both growth and these other things? These are such imperatives, the environment, climate crisis, social justice imperatives. These are such imperatives that we have to focus there only. What would you say to them?
Well, poppycock, you can't have them both. A big part of what's been exciting about working with the Business Roundtable this year with Doug McMillan's leadership is, about this time last year, we said, okay, we need to embrace this idea of stakeholder capitalism, and did a fair amount of work. And you think about it, stakeholder capitalism really speaks to a sustainable business model. Like any business, you have to think about how do you keep it sustainable, otherwise it's going to exhaust some set of resources. Those resources might be natural, right, from the earth, et cetera. There may be the patience of people who are not getting adequate compensation relative to other folks in the organization. And then that's not sustainable long term. And so you have to think about how do you make a more healthy and sustainable business. And so stakeholder capitalism is built around addressing that, ensuring that we're, are not just the shareholders of those businesses, but the employees, the communities in which they operate in, and of course the environment in which we all live. And you have to be more thoughtful about the solutions that you craft, create, and deliver in a way that can hit all of those points. And in advancing that forward, this past 9 months, with the murder of George Floyd, it brought to bear another system that was out of equilibrium, and that was a system of justice and racial justice in this country. And so what Doug did, and it was actually quite brilliant, was start off with 4, now we have 5 subcommittees focused on, I'll call it equitable justice. One is financial justice, healthcare, education, and now we've actually taken broadband out and made it a separate tract. And I believe it's next week that we're going to actually release the report. And you have 180 plus, CEOs, largest corporations in America, putting real energy, effort, and deliberation about what are sustainable solutions, and their staffs. And so, it wasn't just let's talk about it once. Some of the subcommittees had, literally dozens of meetings with experts, hundreds of hours, coming up with solutions. And I've seen obviously part of preliminary copy of the report. I was actually co-chairing the finance committee with Jamie Dimon. And what's been dynamic is we now have solutions, what we call prioritized, organized in 2 camps. One camp, what can we do as corporations today? Hiring practices, think about looking in the mirror first, hiring practices, development practices, organizing, how we deliver our services and resources to the stakeholders that are our employees, that are our shareholders, and then that are our community. And then what we can do through through the window, which looks out and says, okay, what can we be doing for the communities that we serve as well in that context? And so corporations have one set of responsibilities, and of course we also have the set of responsibilities with the Business Roundtable to advise our policymakers, our lawmakers, as to what we think makes sense and how it works in harmony with the fabric of corporate America. And I am just, thrilled with what we've come up with and in the different areas. And I'm thrilled with the commitment levels that companies are making. And you saw JP Morgan make an announcement yesterday, $30 billion that they're putting against this initiative. Bank of America issued this $2 billion bond, which now dozens and hundreds of corporations can now do. And it was, 2.5 times oversubscribed. You can see the stakeholders, the shareholders, public shareholders are interested in these sort of securities that are supporting these types of initiatives. So, the sum and substance is, I think, once you get intelligent business people focused on the problem and bringing their problem-solving skills and understanding how resources can be more purposefully used, you can actually create that sustainable, equitable stakeholder capitalism model, as opposed to saying capitalism doesn't work. No, it just has to now evolve into a better state of equilibrium because, frankly, we're running out of some of the resources that enabled it to operate the way they did over the last 150, 200 years.
That's great. So I guess with the last, I think we have a minute left. I'd love to just say, if you have any parting words to, especially the government, the state and local government officials that are on the webcast.
Yeah, so there's a few things. One, I would invite them all to, of course, give us a call at Vista, give any of the members or a BRT, Josh Bolton, who's our CEO there, a call to get a copy of the report. I was on the phone today with the treasurer of a very large state just south of you, and actually walking through some of the initiatives on education, health, and food deserts, and in broadband to say, here are the real and practical solutions you can implement today. For instance, Hardeep, of course, has pulled together the list of, okay, here are the 13,000 school districts and what levels, where do they have issues in terms of broadband connectivity, access, et cetera. And so those are problems that can be addressed tomorrow by businesses and in partnership with the public sector. So leverage, I'm going to have them actually first call Monica, because she'll get you connected to the right resource and portfolio company within Vista who can be helpful. But second, of course, call me, my office, or the BRT. And I think we can be very helpful in at least giving you some guidance, some thoughts, some expression that has been worked through by business leaders that can enable your economy to, not only get back up and running, but thrive. And the way to make it thrive is you got to just make it more inclusive and enabled for our talented people in all of our communities to really participate and engage.
Okay, well, that's great. I'm so excited that everybody's willing to jump in and help. We actually do have a few more minutes, it turns out, but we talked earlier in the session about how it's going to take, big change is going to take many hands. It's going to take action from a lot of people, and it's going to take collaboration. So one of the earlier concepts that we talked about was how crises can become opportunities. And one thing that came up earlier was when crisis removes past political barriers, that's when it can be an opportunity. As I mentioned, I'm pretty inspired today. I came out of our morning session very filled with hope. So how do you think about crisis kind of becoming opportunity in this particular crisis?
Sure. I think, we all have the opportunity to engage with very talented, creative people to address whatever the crisis might be. If you recall the early part of this year, the first crisis that we faced in the pandemic was how do we get our small businesses to survive? As you know, at Vista, we've got 1.4 million small and medium businesses as customers. And with our portfolio companies, sure, we can deliver the solutions and the services of software. But what if these companies aren't in business, which is one of the reasons, me and my team got involved in, the payroll protection plan program. And so started to engage with administration, with, senators and Congress folks on both sides of the aisle. And not surprisingly, Monica, they all had the same intent and desire to actually go get something done to solve the community's issues of small and medium businesses aren't open for business. How do we keep them alive, and how do we keep them, so that they can come back after, we get to some level of relief from the pandemic? Now, all I can say is kind of interesting, when you see some folks on TV, they'll argue different ways, but when you're having conversations, you need business people to engage with the politicians, and the politicians to engage with the business people. And often, partisan lines kind of melt away because people are saying, I need to keep people employed, I need to create opportunity, and I need to create hope in the communities. And, when you have health disparities and access disparities, now's the time to address them and say, okay, let's rethink these systems, let's rethink these models, and really start to develop, and I call it deliver sustainable solutions to communities, businesses, and to government that can push us to the next set of equilibrium outcomes of how we're going to operate going forward. So I'm optimistic around that, and just was optimistic in my one-on-one conversations with literally hundreds of people in and around this to solve the problems that we had on hand. And now, of course, we have this next wave of likely infections are going to cause similar problems, and we need to re-engage on what are the relief programs, not only for the businesses, but state and local governments that provide services to people in the community who need them.
Yeah, I think coming together to solve hard problems, it's what we're meant to do. And I think, there's so much satisfaction that can come, and this could be a real coming together point. So I think that's wonderful.
Absolutely. And, it's one of those, in terms of, your state and local legislators, education's the first and easiest one to get to, because we know where the problems are. You can handle them. Then you can start thinking about small to medium businesses, and then think about capillary banking systems to drive capital into your small to medium businesses. Because when you get those small to medium businesses thriving, this, they hire more people, stabilizes communities, creates more economic outlook or optimism for the community, because they're saying, oh, gee, these are businesses that are thriving, and I don't have to rely on social services to support my community. I can actually rely on thriving and expanding businesses. So that's I think one of the areas that your groups can engage in tomorrow. And if they need some help and guidance, just feel free to give us a call, and we'll sort through it.
Well, I'd love to tap there for just a moment. According to a 2018 Small Business Administration report, 99% of business activity in Oregon is small business. And that it's been small businesses that have been hit by this, primarily suffered by the pandemic and all the subsequent shutdown orders. And you talked about the CDFIs and the capillary banking systems, and I think, the access to capital, but there's more to it than just that, right? And, we've talked about entrepreneurs of color have been hardest hit during the pandemic. So what advice do you have for all of us as Oregonians, and how we support small business owners?
There's a couple ways, and that statistic isn't too off the national norm. 90% of businesses in America are small business, right? And it's really, and most of those businesses find themselves in need of capital for expansion. I think about the small business opportunity in a couple buckets. Not surprisingly, one of the first is what I call the modern of the small business. So we've been working with a couple of groups, PayPal, my buddy Dan over there, PayPal and Square and others, saying, okay, with some of our portfolio companies, how do we create what I call business in a box, right? So how do you get a small business that otherwise wouldn't access technology to leverage technology? And as you know, when you implement software solutions, typically in a small to medium business, it's a 900% ROI, okay? So, scheduling software, inventory management software, payroll software, massive ROI, but a lot of the companies are saying, well, I don't know how to use it, how to embrace it, how to buy it, don't have broadband, all those sorts of things. So we're trying to create what I call modular and packetized solutions that, I call it every t-shirt size, small, medium, large type small businesses can buy and say, okay, here's the packet of solutions for payment processing, for payroll, all those sorts of things. But now that they can leverage, creates a massive efficiency in the way they run their businesses. So that's kind of point one. And which includes, of course, delivering online, commerce, e-commerce, or in the case of restaurants, which we did with one of our companies, Upserve, for instance, curbside ordering or online ordering, those sort of things. All those are technology-enabled solutions that create massive ROI for those small businesses. So that's point one. Point two, lending. You got to, those businesses, sometimes you just need 30,000, 50,000, 100,000. You can increase the size of your business, add an extra barber chair, buy a little more inventory, whatever it might be, factor some of your receivables, which if you think about, that's the next push. There is, at the high level, the largest banks are saying, okay, let's focus on changing and evaluating other elements of credit, not just the standard credit, because a lot of small businesses run their businesses on credit cards, right? They're not out there with a credit line. They're using credit cards. Okay, now how do the large banks now create credit evaluation, which we can do with technology capability, so that these small businesses say this is a business that we should lend money to, or we should factor, like part of the Bank of America piece and the JP Morgan piece was, well, why don't we factor some of the receivables? Because if you get a receivable from Apple Computer, why are you waiting 90 days? You should be able to factor that at close to money, 100%, because it's going to be likely a good receivable, so that you can recirculate that working capital. And then at the smaller level, the CDFIs and MDIs modernizing their infrastructure. I was on the phone with one of my, it's come to be a friend who runs one of the largest CDFIs. He said, Robert, we did 50 loans a year prior to you guys coming in, modernization, all that. He said we did 17,000 loans in 5 months now by modernizing the infrastructure. It's the CDFIs and MDIs who actually know those small to medium businesses are in a community. They need capital and they need modernization. So the larger banks can deliver products into those CDFIs and MDIs that these small banks can use because they have access. We just need to deliver capital, which is part of what the whole idea around the PPP program was, deliver capital. But now create a sustainable solution of delivering capital into those businesses that can modernize. And believe it or not, that whole capillary infrastructure, MDI, CDFIs, we can modernize their entire infrastructure for about $500 million. Okay, and then all of a sudden you've got state-of-the-art lending capacity across every community in essence in the United States. And now you just have to put capital in it in a way that you can deliver to these small and medium businesses.
Yeah, bringing technology and modernizing infrastructure definitely seems like critical things for all of Oregon to look at. One thing we learned also is Oregon Business Plan is trying to take a little bit of a long-term view, even though there's so many immediate crises, and thinking about resilience. I think what we've learned about is needing to have a resilient economy to multiple different outcomes, and when so much uncertainty. How would you ask people to think about Oregon's long-term future in terms of building resilience into the economy?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't want to be a hammer and everything kind of sounds like a nail, but I think building technical infrastructure capacity. On the one hand, you have just basic things like broadband, which brings a true infrastructure capacity. But you also have to think about infrastructure capacity on learning pyramids, right? Which are educational systems to train students, train employees, retrain employees to participate in a digital economy. And then at the other end of the spectrum, investing in, systems applications to make various types of businesses more efficient. Think about the type of businesses that are in Oregon. Of course, you have multiple services type companies, manufacturing type companies, and encouraging and creating opportunities for those businesses to invest in their technical infrastructure, because that's what creates the productivity ultimately and gives them the ability to compete long term in all markets, as opposed to staying local or regional, because you just don't have the reach, capacity, or understanding of how these other markets are evolving. You have to have access to them, and those are infrastructure pieces that you need to develop and build and invest in. And I'd encourage Oregon Business Plan to really engage with your state legislators and talk about how and do build out these infrastructure. You build the state-of-the-art infrastructure, and you will attract a business, you will attract people. And what we're finding, Monica, you know this, we're finding that, okay, since we've all learned how to work more efficiently in distance, you can work for any company anywhere. So why not be in a place that you enjoy, as beautiful as Oregon, and make sure you build out an infrastructure that can support global commerce engagement, because you've got a digital backbone to enable that.
Absolutely. Oregon is a beautiful place, and we're very lucky to live here. And I know it's a draw for many people. So, okay, let's come back to the social justice issues.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? What would you say to business leaders? What should they do if they had an action plan? You know, I know that you're a man of action plans and accountability and, you know, keeping yourself on task and have goals. I think that's what it's all about.
Yeah. So I always say the most important thing is to look in the mirror in that context, and that means your hiring, development practices. You know, your board. What's your board look like? What does your senior management team look like? What's your mid-level management look like? What do your entry-level people look like? And what do your interns look like? And if you say, man, they all look like me, and you don't look like me, then you should say, wow, let's change how this looks, and start building your programming. You know, I think the easiest way is interns. You know this, Monica. I say if you're going to hire 3 interns, hire 10, okay, and make it a sustainable program, not just for the interns, but for the people who are, your mentors or supervisors of those interns. There's a shared learning experience that comes, and you may have them there 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, whatever it is, and it's a free look at employees. Then look at how you do your developmental work for your mid-level managers, so they have a understanding, because it takes time for people who aren't engaging anymore with people of different backgrounds or racial identity, to get to know each other, and then think about it at your board level and thinking about it at your senior management level. But you've got to invest in the time, energy, and effort to get that, but you can get it right. You absolutely can get it right, and but it's senior management and senior leadership that if you do that well, it will pay off multiples in the future. So that's how you really think about 10-year expansion plans. So engage in your hiring of your interns, your mid-level people, and create development opportunities internally to make that all happen. So that 10 years from now, we look back at it and say, wow, we've made up this racial disparity. We've created massive opportunity. Communities are safer. People are more prosperous. We're be able to sell our products into all markets, easily and competitively. And I've got the most technologically advanced workforce that's available because I've got systems in place leveraging learning management to keep my employees moving forward.
That's great. And I know you spend a lot of time with business leaders and give that advice often. I know you've been spending a lot of time with policymakers. Do you have any advice for them on the social justice issues?
Yeah, I think it's similar. Listen to the communities, and frankly, you have to do a lot of training, and you have to get rid of people who are bringing bias to their work, and you just have to do it. And if you do that, you'll find that the communities will support you, and those communities, everyone wants to live in a safe, prosperous community. But it's all got to come hand in hand. You got to deliver prosperity tools into those communities, and you also have to deliver what I call, a equitable justice into those communities as well.
And when you think about bias, do you think about it as removing people who bring bias into their work, or do you think also at a systemic way about all of us having bias that are built in, and how do you remove that kind of systemic bias?
Yeah, it's natural. Most people of all ethnicities or racial identity have some sort of bias, because it comes as a part of your upbringing, unless you were raised in a truly multicultural society or community, of which there aren't enough of in America. And so we have to actively think and train and learn, A, what our biases are, and B, why they actually inhibit our ability to grow. And I think, generally people do want to grow, and generally they do want to live a high quality of life and feel safer. And a part of that is having better understanding of people. I had the good fortune of growing up in a community where, we played sports and band, and was as multicultural as only as probably more multicultural, I'll say, than most communities that people grew up in. So I didn't grow up with the same level of bias as most, but I was able to witness it and experience it, and still experience it. And the dynamic that I always focus on is take the time. When you sit next to somebody and play an instrument, and they come from a different background, and for a couple semesters, you kind of learn about them, they learn about you, and you play sports with them, or you're doing AP physics with them. You learn because you're in an environment where you're challenged by something together, and in some cases you get a chance to create something together. And that's an important part to think about in the work place as well. So that's really what I would focus on, is how do we create more multicultural experiences. And it's harder now in this age of COVID because our experiences are really our family. But when we come out of it, I think we should embrace a different equilibrium of engagement. And some of that engagement may not be all in person, but we're used to having digital engagements that can aid to that experience.
It sounds like so much of your upbringing. I know it's impacted you. I know your parents were both teachers, and so I love that you're talking so much about the educational system and how to bring equality to the educational system through what our school is doing. Well, and I think we are actually out of time. So thank you so much, Robert, for spending the time with us and being here this morning.
Always a pleasure, Monica. Yeah, always a pleasure. And, and thank you for inviting me, and all the best of luck with the Oregon business plan. And again, if there's any follow-up activities, just make sure you reach out, and we'll figure out who can be helpful.
We'll definitely do that. All right. Thank you so much. And back to you, Josh.
All right. Take care.
Well, that was, I'd say that was one of the highlights of my year right there. So thank you, Monica, for such an engaging discussion with Robert Smith, and so much work done by Robert and his staff and his team, and so impressive. It's something for all of us to aspire to, just to participate in the smallest amount of the work that team is doing. So thank you again, Monica, for hosting that. That's fantastic. Well, that brings us to a wrap for today's session, and what an engaging, rich discussion we had across the board, and something that we can all probably leave this afternoon and reflect on. And I challenge everyone to just take, again, 2 or 3 things that you learned today that came out of this session that you can do to make a difference as we go forward. And as I've said previously, we're all in this together, so let's do it together as we move ahead. And speaking of moving ahead, we have some more content coming up for you. The next one is on workforce, and on on October 21st at 2:30. As the experts you see here consider how we reimagine talent development and prepare Oregonians for the jobs of today and the future. Also to ensure equitable opportunity for people of color, as well as low income and rural Oregonians. And I think today, if you heard a common theme by all of our leaders and our speakers, it really was around that topic and how we engage, where we engage, and where we move forward. So I think this will be an excellent next session for us to build off of the content from today. And then actually on October 20th, we are very excited to be joined by Congressman DeFazio. And there'll be a conversation with the congressman about what we can expect from potential infrastructure package in 2021 and what Oregon should be doing to prepare now for those changes. So some great content coming up. The 20th and the 21st is only a week away, so please block the time on your calendar and look forward to having you join us for those next 2 sessions. So thanks again for everybody. Thanks for being with us today and participating in a great day of content. And we look forward to continuing to move forward as we build the structure of the business plan around shared prosperity. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you next week.